Welcome, lords and ladies, back to the realm. I am your host, the Go King, and today we dive headfirst into familiars. From how to get one, all the way to the crazy things they can become. As always, I will have a link in the description to the free online Pathfinder resource, Archives of Nethys. If you want to track down all the rules in the books, most of what you'll be looking for can be found in the core rulebook and Advanced Player's Guide. But we will also be pulling from Secrets of Magic, Book of the Dead, and Rage of Elements. And without further ado, let's start the show. I want to start here with the options that will allow you to obtain and empower your familiar. But if you want to skip straight to the familiar rules, jump to this time. Alchemists are occasionally seen with familiars, usually something created through or empowered by alchemy. An alchemist can take the alchemical familiar feat at first level. This familiar is a homunculus, and it uses the alchemist's intelligent attribute for its skills and perception. The sorcerer, wizard, and magus classes are no stranger to familiars. They all have a level 1 feat that grants them a familiar. The wizard can gain this feat for free through the improved familiar attunement Arcane Thesis. This option also gives the familiar an additional ability at level 1, 6, 12, and 18. Each of these classes can also take the level 2 feat Enhanced Familiar. This feat gives the familiar 2 additional abilities. Druids well attuned to plant life are often seen with Leshy familiars. Druids can gain a Leshy familiar through the Leaf Druid Order. They can take the Enhanced Familiar feat at level 2. At level 4, Druids can take Leshy Familiar Secrets. This feat gives the Leshy Familiar one additional ability that it must choose from this short list. Grasping Tendrils, which gives it a fantastic 15-foot reach. Purify Air, allowing one medium creature to breathe in a confined space, or giving creatures within 15 feet a bonus against inhaled effects and poisons. And Verdant Burst, causing an explosion of healing energy if the familiar dies. This is the 3-action heal spell heightened to 1 less than your highest spell rank. The Thaumaturge is a class I didn't expect to excel with a familiar, and yet at level 1 they may take the familiar feat, at level 2 they may take the feat Enhanced Familiar, and at level 8 they may take Incredible Familiar. Incredible Familiar requires Enhanced Familiar as a prerequisite. This gives your familiar another 2 abilities, for a total of 6 abilities. The Kineticist is a confusing one where familiars are concerned. There's a level 1 Kineticist feat that gives them an elemental familiar matching their gait. Now, my initial assumption is that this would be a basic familiar with the elemental ability, except the elemental ability requires the resistance ability as a prerequisite for basic familiars. That would use up both abilities, and since the Kineticist never gets to upgrade the familiar, this would be very restrictive, and negate all the best parts of the familiar system. No swapping abilities, and they'd never be able to take a specific familiar. I would like to see some clarification on this one. If the Kineticist's familiar wasn't required to take that prerequisite ability, that would open up some options. The Witch is the class that most emphasizes and empowers familiars. All witches have a familiar sent to them by their patron. These familiars start with an extra ability and gain more at 6th, 12th, and 18th level, much like the improved familiar attunement wizard subclass. The witch has a first level feat, Wart Witch, that transforms their familiar into a Leshy. However, most of the text for this feat is about giving the witch themselves abilities around dense foliage. The Witch can take Enhanced Familiar at level 2 and Incredible Familiar at level 8. But between those feats, the Witch can take Improved Familiar at level 4. Try to keep those all distinct in your head if you can. Improved Familiar reduces the number of abilities your familiar needs access to by 2 in order to become a specific familiar. And at level 12, the Familiar's Eye's feat allows a witch to perceive from their familiar's senses rather than their own. Now, if you don't want to play a witch just to get a powerful familiar, or if you just want to get access to extra cool abilities for your familiar, you might take the Familiar Master archetype. The dedication, available at level 2, gives you a familiar. Or, if you already have a familiar, you gain the Enhanced Familiar feat. But if you're getting your familiar from the archetype, you can still take the Enhanced Familiar feat just at level 4. Likewise, Improved Familiar and Incredible Familiar are also available at a 2-level delay, 6th and 10th levels respectively. But the Familiar Master is more than raw power. They can get cool abilities too. Familiar Mascot, a level 4 feat, allows your familiar's abilities to benefit characters other than their master, and this is limited to 1 character per ability. Familiar Conduit is a level 4 meta magic feat requiring, obviously, you to have the ability to cast spells. As long as you have line of effect to your familiar, you can spend an additional action casting a spell with a range, only having it originate from your familiar. Finally, Mutable Familiar at level 8 allows you to swap out abilities as a 10-minute activity to and from the ones on this list: Amphibious, Burrower, Climber, Dark Vision, Fast Movement, Manual Dexterity, Resistance, and Scent. So nothing extravagant. Also, keep in mind, this does not allow you to swap out abilities your familiar is required to have, or that are prerequisites to other abilities. That just about sums up all the player character options for getting and modifying familiars, excluding options from Adventures and the Lost Omens line. Now, the rules for basic familiars are quite simple. They are tiny creatures, usually a mundane animal before they became a familiar. A familiar's armor class and saves match their master's, and they gain a bonus to perception, acrobatics, and stealth, equal to their master's level, plus their spellcasting ability modifier, or charisma if you have no spellcasting modifier. They gain a bonus to perception, acrobatics, and stealth, equal to their master's level, plus their master's spellcasting ability modifier, or charisma modifier if they don't have a spellcasting mod. They have 5 hit points per character level of their master. They have low light vision and can communicate empathically with their master up to 1 mile away. They start with either a 25-foot land speed or a 25-foot swim speed. If killed, they can be restored with a week of downtime, though a witch's familiar returns on their own in the morning. Each day, a familiar is granted 2 abilities chosen by its master. If it is an animal that would require specific abilities, those abilities must be chosen. For example, a songbird would be required to take the flyer ability. In some ways, this makes the most useless animals the most flexible familiars. These abilities come in 2 categories. Familiar abilities primarily benefit the familiar, and master abilities primarily benefit, you guessed it, their master. From the core rulebook, we have the familiar abilities Amphibious, granting either a 25-foot swim or land speed, Burrower, granting a 5-foot burrow speed, Climber, granting a 25-foot climb speed, Damage Avoidance, the familiar takes no damage on a success of a specifically chosen save, Dark Vision, Fast Movement, granting an increase to 1 speed from 25 feet to 40 feet, Flyer, granting a 25-foot fly speed, Kin Speech, granting the ability to speak with similar animals. This requires the speech ability as a prerequisite, and for the master to be 6th level. Lab Assistant, granting the ability to use the Quick Alchemy action, though this requires the Manual Dexterity ability, and for the master to have Quick Alchemy. Speaking of, Manual Dexterity grants the ability to perform manipulate actions with 2 limbs. Scent grants 30-foot imprecise scent, and Speech grants the ability to understand and speak a language the master knows. The master abilities here are a little more mechanically impressive, and they have some relatively obvious requirements. Cantrip Connection grants an extra cantrip. Extra Reagents allows the familiar to create an extra infused reagent each day for their master. Familiar Focus. Once per day as a 2-action activity, the familiar can restore a focus point for their master. Lifelink allows the master to use a reaction to take damage that would otherwise reduce the familiar to 0 hit points. Spell Battery grants an additional spell slot at 3 levels, or when the remaster takes effect, ranks, less than your highest spell slot. Spell Delivery allows the familiar to carry the effects of a touch range spell to a target. The familiar must start in the master's space and deliver the spell the same turn that the spell was cast, otherwise the spell is lost. The Advanced Player's Guide only added 2 master abilities. Innate Surge allows the master once per day to cast an innate spell already expended. Share Senses once every 10 minutes allows the master to see through the familiar's senses for 1 minute. There are 14 more familiar abilities. Accompanist allows the familiar to provide their master a bonus to performance checks, +1 or +3 if the master is a master in performance. Focused Rejuvenation heals the familiar 1 hit point per master level when their master uses the refocus activity. Independent grants the familiar an action when they aren't commanded. Master's Form, as an action, the familiar can transform into a humanoid of their master's ancestry, age, and gender. They retain some feature or giveaway that shows that they aren't what they seem. This is a cosmetic change. Both manual dexterity and speech are required in order to take Master's Form. Partner in Crime grants a reaction that can only be used to aid when their master attempts a deception or thievery skill check. This is an automatic success or critical success if the master is a master in the skill being used. Plant form can only be taken by plant-based familiars, but it allows them to transform into a tiny plant, similar to their natural form. Poison Reservoir can only be taken by a homunculus familiar, but it allows the familiar to apply an injury poison to an adjacent ally's weapon as a single action. The master must supply the poison to the familiar with 2 interact actions before each use. Resistance grants half the master's level resistances against 2 damage types to the familiar. The damage types that can be chosen are acid, cold, electricity, fire, poison, or sonic. Skilled, choosing a skill other than acrobatics or stealth, the familiar gets a bonus to that skill equal to their master's level, plus their spell casting key ability modifier. Skilled can be taken more than once to gain several different skills. Spellcasting grants the familiar a once per day spell, using their master's spell attack and DC. This spell must be one of their master's spells, and it must be 5 levels or ranks lower than their master's highest spell level or rank. Toolbearer grants the familiar the ability to carry a light bulk set of tools for their master. The master can then draw and use the tools as if they were wearing the tools themselves when the familiar is adjacent to them. Manual dexterity is required to take Toolbearer. Touch telepathy allows the familiar to communicate with their master telepathically when touching. If they also have the speech ability, touch telepathy works on any creature they share a language with. Tough grants an extra 2 hit points per master level. Valet allows the familiar to retrieve worn items for you. It can retrieve an item for each of its actions, placing them into your hands as needed. This usually means it can retrieve 2 items. It can't retrieve stowed items in this way. Valet is a meaningful, if unimpressive, upgrade to their master's action economy. That covers all the abilities in the Advanced Player's Guide. We can find a few more in some of the other books, but before we move on, let's talk specific familiars. While normal familiars are usually magically gifted or transformed animals, specific familiars are specific, tiny magical creatures, attracted to serve powerful casters and the like. For a witch, their familiar might have always been one of these creatures, simply in disguise. To attract a specific familiar, your familiar must meet a required number of abilities. At this point, you may attract a specific familiar, dismissing your normal familiar. Transitioning from a specific familiar back to a normal familiar, or to a different specific familiar, requires a week of downtime as if your familiar had died. When you take a specific familiar, they lose the required number of abilities, replacing them with their granted abilities, which are otherwise normal, familiar, and master abilities, and the unique abilities of the specific familiar. You cannot change these abilities as they are required, but if your familiar gains more than the required number of abilities, you can change the excess abilities. Otherwise, a specific familiar functions as any other familiar. Here in the Advanced Player's Guide, there are 3 specific familiars. The Fairy Dragon is a mischievous creature requiring 6 abilities. Its granted abilities are Amphibious, Dark Vision, Flyer, Manual Dexterity, Speech, and Touch Telepathy. Its unique ability is a breath weapon that stupefies and slows. Imps are fiendish familiars who feign subservience while tempting their master towards evil. They require 8 abilities, and their granted abilities are Dark Vision, Flyer, Manual Dexterity, Resistance against Fire and Poison, Skilled in Deception, Speech, and Touch Telepathy. Their unique abilities are Imp Invisibility. Once per hour, they can cast a 2nd level or rank invisibility on themselves. And Infernal Temptation. As a single action once per day, the imp offers a creature within 15 feet a boon. If the creature accepts, once during the hour they can roll an attack roll or save with fortune. If the creature dies during this hour, their soul goes to hell. Spell slimes are oozes created by the leftover magic of spells. Only a spellcaster can have a spell slime familiar, and spell slimes are very loyal to their master. Spell slimes require 4 abilities and grant Climber, Dark Vision, and Tough. Their unique abilities are Magic Scent. It's a 30-foot imprecise sense for magic matching your tradition. Ooze Defense. They're immune to critical hits and precision damage, but only have an armor class equal to 10 plus their master's level. And Slime Rejuvenation. This is focused rejuvenation, but the recovered hit points are 2 per level rather than 1. Secrets of Magic gave us a little more on familiars, specifically in the section on Shadow Magic and Shadow Companions. We get 2 familiar abilities. Dark Eater allows the familiar to regain hit points equal to half their master's level after 10 minutes in dim light or darkness. And Shadow Step, requiring the master be at least 7th level. Shadow Step gives the familiar the Shadow Step action. As a single action, Shadow Step teleports the familiar from one area of dim light or darkness to another. The Shadow Familiar is usually only accessed by Shadow Casters. However, the specific magics needed to create them can be found and used by others. A Shadow Familiar is in fact the shadow of its master. They require 7 abilities, and their granted abilities are Dark Vision, Manual Dexterity, Master's Form, Resistance to Cold and Negative, and Shadow Step. Their unique abilities are Become Shadow. As a single action, the familiar becomes a barely tangible shadow, gaining resistance equal to half the master's level to all damage except force, and able to slip through thin gaps. In this form, the familiar can't do anything that requires a physical form. Slink in Shadows allows the familiar to hide or end a sneak in a shadow, even that of a creature, and Steal Shadow, once per 10 minutes as a single action, the familiar can make a melee attack with the spell attack roll modifier of their master. On a hit, the target is enfeebled 1 and loses its shadow for 24 hours, or until something would remove the enfeebled condition. Book of the Dead brings us 4 more specific familiars, all of which are undead and have the undead unique ability. A familiar with this ability has negative healing and immunity to death effects, disease, poison, and unconscious. Unfortunately, they are destroyed if they reach 0 hit points. Crawling hands are often chosen as a fashion statement by aesthetically minded necromancers. They require 5 abilities, and their granted abilities are manual dexterity, spell delivery, and valet. Their unique ability is lend a hand. This ability gives the familiar a reaction that can only be used to aid an attack roll of an ally with whom they share space. The old friend is the spirit of a cherished pet come back to aid its owner. The old friend requires 4 abilities, and its only granted ability is flyer. Its unique abilities are invisibility, which functions precisely the same as the imp-specific familiar's imp invisibility, and anchored incorporeality. This gives the familiar the incorporeal trait, meaning it can move through solid objects and creatures, who can also move through it. It can't attempt strength-based checks, or have them attempted against it. However, the familiar doesn't gain resistance to all damage, nor immunity to precision damage. They must stay within 60 feet of their anchor, usually some memento from their life. In this case, it may be a favorite toy or their collar, and they must maintain line of effect with their anchor. This usually means they can't pass fully through a wall, as walls block line of effect. The Polong is a little different. These malicious spirits are bound to bottles of blood. They must be created by the master they are to serve, a process that can take up to 2 weeks. And they must be fed their master's blood daily. If their bottle is ever destroyed, or if their master doesn't feed them, they are destroyed. Polongs require 8 abilities, and their granted abilities are Flyer, Lifelink, Skilled in Society, Spellcasting, and Speech. Their unique abilities are Anchored Incorporeality, treating their bottle as their anchor, and Polong Possession. Polong Possession is a 2-action activity where the familiar attempts to possess an adjacent creature. The creature attempts a will save against the master's class or spell DC. On a failure, the familiar possesses the creature for 1 minute, 24 hours on a critical failure. The familiar exerts no control over the creature, but for the duration, the familiar sees through the creature's eyes and causes them to be drained 1. For the duration, the familiar is not bound by any range or line of effect limitation to their anchor. If they are not within range or line of effect when the possession ends, they immediately return to their anchor. Notably, while Polongs are traditionally invisible, this entry does not clearly state that the familiar is invisible as well, so be sure to check with your game master for their ruling on this one. To keep a talking head is to keep an unliving encyclopedia, if you can withstand their constant yammering. The talking head requires 3 abilities, and its granted abilities are Cantrip Connection, Skilled in Arcana, Occultism, or 1 lore skill, and Speech. Its unique ability is Heads Will Roll. Unless it's given the Flyer ability, the familiar's only movement is rolling 15 feet. If they must move faster, other creatures can kick or throw the familiar 30 feet as a single action. Now we come to Elemental Familiars, our final group of abilities and specific familiars today. These come from Rage of Elements, where we are presented with 3 new abilities and 5 new specific familiars. The abilities are Elemental, which makes the familiar an elemental creature rather than an animal. In fact, Leshy familiars and Undead familiars, and presumably Homunculus familiars, can't take this ability. Elemental requires the resistance ability as a prerequisite, and the familiar becomes immune to bleed, paralyzed, poison, sleep, and their chosen element, be it air, earth, fire, metal, water, or wood. Jet allows a familiar to leap 30 feet on a jet of elemental or magical energy. They must start and end the movement on solid ground. Levitator allows the familiar to levitate 3 feet up from solid or liquid surfaces. They have a 25-foot move speed while levitating. This allows the familiar to avoid difficult terrain, hazards, and most effects or triggers that require contact with the ground. Mooncloud is the first specific familiar in this list, and they're said to be related to despairing Pauls. These tiny, emotional clouds require 3 abilities, and their granted abilities are Elemental, but they must choose Air, and Flyer. Their unique ability is Emote. As a single action, limited to once per round, the familiar makes a face, be it inscrutable, friendly, or angry. Doing this counts as preparing to aid their master at a deception, diplomacy, or intimidation skill check respectively. They gain a reaction that can only be used for this aid, and they automatically succeed or critically succeed if their master is a master in the chosen skill. A Chrismal Shardling is an immature version of a Shardling, whose hunger for crystals has been sated by magic. They require 3 abilities, and their granted abilities are Burrower, Elemental, but they must choose Earth, and Speech. Their unique ability is Crystal Scent. This has the same effects as Scent, except it senses crystals or gems with a 60-foot range. Elemental Wisps are tiny elemental wisps with big personalities, usually based on their element. Playful air wisps, timid earth wisps, carefree fire wisps, morose metal wisps, gentle water wisps, and lastly, the controlling wood wisps. They require 3 abilities, and their granted abilities are Accompanist, Elemental, and Speech. Their unique abilities are Elemental Mobility. This gives the familiar a normal movement ability based on its element, Flyer for air, Burrower for earth, Jet for fire, Levitator for metal, Amphibious for water, and Climber for wood. Innate element means a wisp's element can't be changed like with a normal familiar who's given the elemental ability. And Resonance is a 30-foot aura giving a +1 status bonus to damage rolls for alchemy and magic that have the same element as the wisp. Genane are minor genies who often act as messengers. They require 5 abilities, and their granted abilities are Elemental and Speech. Their unique abilities are Elemental Mobility, the same as the Wisp, Little Wish, a 1-day reaction the familiar can use to give a creature within 60 feet, Fortune on a saving throw or skill check, and Elemental Diplomat, which provides the familiar or their master, if they're in the same space, a +1 circumstance bonus to diplomacy checks against elementals. The familiar's bonus to the diplomacy skill is their master's level plus the master's spellcasting key attribute modifier. And finally, the elemental scamp. And just look at that guy. It's no wonder scamps got so popular so quick. Scamps are mischievous and highly ego-driven, often demanding their long names and many titles be spoken in full. Elemental scamps require 5 abilities, and their granted abilities are Elemental, Flyer, and Speech. Their unique abilities are Elemental Mobility, the same as the Wisp, Elemental Breath, a 2-action, once per hour, 10-foot cone breath weapon. This deals 1d6 damage per 2 master levels. Scamp Elements is a separate ability that determines the damage type of Elemental Breath. Air is slashing, Earth is bludgeoning, fire is, fire, metal is also slashing, water is acid, and wood is poison. This ability also acts like the Wisp's innate element, preventing the Scamp's element from changing after it's chosen. And that, lords and ladies, is all we have on familiars at this time, ignoring options from Adventure Paths and the Lost Omens books. All the basics are covered by the core rulebook and the Advanced Player's Guide. Shadow-based familiars were featured in Secrets of Magic, Undead familiars in Book of the Dead, and elemental familiars in Rage of Elements. What kinds of familiars might we get when Howl of the Wild comes out? Do you think familiars will see any significant change in the remaster? Thank you for visiting the realm. I have been your host, the Go King, and as always, travel with loyal companions.